This is Deke Dickerson, and you're listening to
Down in the wrecking yard, I met my true love. Down in the wrecking yard, I met my true love, called a wreck Chevrolet, which I see every day.
I got a big guitar and I play it good, right up and down the strings like a picker should. Well, the neighbors are complaining, say it sounds like mud. Well, they call me Mr. Daddy, say you're all washed up. I don't believe what they say, I know it can't happen that way. Hey girls, y'all going my way?
And we're back. Hi, this is Tony. I'm back at the wrecking yard, and apparently if you're listening to this, then so are you. I know it's been a couple of months since the last podcast. I've been playing around with the idea of possibly referring to each cluster of podcasts as a series, Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, but that's not really being truthful, you know. This is an expensive endeavor, and the people I like to talk to, or the people I want to talk to, or the people that will talk to me don't happen to live in my city always, so there's some traveling involved, and it's damn expensive. But anyway, I've got some good stuff coming to you for the next couple weeks, and today particularly so. I got to talk to one of my big heroes, and honestly one of my very favorite living guitar players, Deke Dickerson. I first became familiar with Deke's work with the release of the Dave and Deke combo record, Hollywood Barn Dance, an album that pretty much is as good as it gets. I mean, I guess, you know, you have to appreciate a certain amount of twang, but I do, and I did. And if you ever see a copy of Hollywood Barn Dance and you want an album that's virtually perfect, great songs from beginning to end, great playing, well, you should buy it. You should buy it. I saw the Dave and Deke combo in the original incarnation in Chicago back in the 90s, and it was to this day one of the very, very best shows I've ever seen. I could not believe how tight they were playing, how good the songs were. It was just almost otherworldly. Sadly, they broke up shortly after that. I go into that subject a little bit with Deke during the interview, and he's pretty forthcoming about it, actually. You know, a lot of times people will say, well, you know, musical differences, or I needed to spend time with my family, or whatever excuse they give, but he basically copped to the idea that, you know, he wanted to be in charge, and he didn't feel like he was in charge in that particular situation, and so he needed to go and find a little better situation for himself. No hard feelings, though, because since then, for the time that I was living in Los Angeles, I saw them on 3 separate occasions when they had reunion gigs. Each one of them, I don't know how much they practiced, but every time they played, they were tight as a drum and really, really entertaining. And as far as guitar playing is concerned, you're just not going to see much better. You're just not going to see much better than when Deke straps it on and starts to go. I don't want to sound like I'm gushing or anything, but honestly, he really is one of my very favorite guitar players. So anyway, we got to spend an afternoon at Deke's house. We had a very good conversation, and afterwards we took a little bit of footage around the house, which I assembled into a short film, which you can view if you go to the Wrecking Yard website and then click on the Deke Dickerson page, and it will have the short film Deke's Antiques on it, which will feature some interesting things that Deke has found through the years, and also a pretty good look at Johnny Horton's stereo. And if you don't know what that means or don't care, well, when you get to the end of the interview and he tells the story about it, you may actually become curious. But anyway, Deke was really nice, really friendly, really welcoming. He was just basically the perfect host, and he put up with us for most of the afternoon. I mean, we ate up a good portion of his day, and he was nothing but friendly and diplomatic throughout the entire ordeal, which, I have no idea whether he actually enjoyed or not, but he seemed to. So I'll just take it at face value and assume that he did. Anyway, I just want to thank Deke again for the gift of his time and for his patience and his hospitality. I want to suggest to everybody out there that should you run across a Dave and Deke album, or more specifically a Deke Dickerson solo record, buy it. You should get it. There's not a bad one. And especially if you're a guitar player, I mean, you'll probably learn something. As far as the Wrecking Yard is concerned, we have a couple more podcasts coming up over the next few weeks. A couple of really good ones. And then I should be going up to Minnesota for the legendary Stardust Cowboys birthday party. I'm going to do some podcast work up there, maybe do another short film or two with him and the various band members and the people that show up to help him celebrate his birthday. And then after that, we may go on another short hiatus. I don't know. I don't like to ask for money, but hey, if anybody has any extra and they'd like to go to the website and give it to me, I can only promise you that any money sent my way will be used for road trips to Nashville, Chicago, New York, possibly Texas, pretty sure Michigan. I got a lot of people to talk to and a lot of places to go, so anybody who's feeling generous, I thank them in advance. That's enough of my yapping. Let's get down to it. Here it is, my conversation with Deke
From the
Dickerson.
beginning. You're from Missouri, is that correct?
I am. I was born in St. Louis, lived most of my life in Columbia, Missouri. That's where my dad still lives there, and, my parents still live there long after I left there.
Right. So, chop suey?
Chop suey? I'm not getting the reference.
St. Louis is the chop suey capital of the United States.
Well, see, my folks were hillbillies from Virginia that moved to Missouri to get college education. So it was still mostly, cornbread and liver and onions and that sort of thing growing up. I can remember when we first went out to, Taco Bell to experience Mexican food.
Right. That's how it was before. I grew up in the suburbs, so it was exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
But yeah, someone told me that after they built the railroads, that a lot of the Chinese laborers ended up in St. Louis, and that they had to try to figure out how to make their food palatable to us, and thus chop suey. And apparently there are more chop suey shops in St. Louis than any other city in the United States.
Strangely enough, I don't remember that, but I was
Really?
I was 8 years old when I left St. Louis.
So yeah. Well, I used to work on the road a lot. I don't know if you remember back in the 80s if you went to a lot of records conventions.
Yeah.
I was that guy who was selling bootleg videotapes over in the corner. And so I spent a lot of time on the road for about 8 to 10 years, and I'm not really big on fast food, so we took those Jane and Michael Stern books out with us when we hit the road.
Oh yeah, I used to do that too.
That's how I found Arthur Bryant's.
Yeah.
That's how I found Craig's Barbecue in Deville's Bluff,
That's
Arkansas.
how you had to do it before the internet, you know.
It really was. Now, they have a website. You can just go look something up or have it on your phone or whatever.
Yeah.
But back then, we got a book. We're like going, I think we turn here, I think. You know? And I can't tell you how many times we'd, go an hour and a half out of our way just to find out the place is, closed or was closed.
Yeah,
or they
exactly.
ran out of pies. That happened a lot because, there was mostly mom and pop places in the book. So it was very common. You'd go to, the greatest pie shop in the world and all I've got left is persimmon.
Yeah.
So, now, you are slightly younger than I am, and most of the people I've talked to so far, minus one glaring omission, have been all sort of within my age range. And so everybody has the same beginnings, and that beginnings is almost always the Beatles. Now, I know that you're not a huge Beatle fan, and I'm imagining you were born in '68, so you probably don't remember them on the Ed Sullivan Show so much.
People people misunderstand my statements about the Beatles. I like the Beatles fine. It's just, for me, I like the Hollies and the Who and the Kinks. Sure. To me, those groups are equally as great. The Rolling Stones.
The Kinks, for me, that's the big one.
I don't get why in 2017, if Paul McCartney farts, it's like front page news on every newspaper in the world. Like, really, why are they so much more important than every other band? Like, I mean, I get it that if you were around during that time, and especially if you saw them on the Ed Sullivan Show, it probably changed everything, like a big tidal wave. But like you said, I came along a little bit later. Really, I grew up in the punk rock era. And my dad listened to country music, so it's like I came at the Beatles way after I had already been listening to Elvis and George Jones and Hank Williams, and for that matter, the Ramones and all that. I literally didn't listen to the Beatles until after I listened to the Ramones.
Well, for me, the Beatles and Ed Sullivan, I don't know which one. It probably wasn't the first one because I was only 2. That's my first memory. That my very, very first memory that I still have logged in here is my mom was watching the Ed Sullivan Show, and my dad worked nights, so she was by herself. And I came wandering out of my room, and I was wearing Huckleberry Hound pajamas with the plastic footy bottoms that go when you walk. And my mom let me sit on the couch, and the Beatles were on, Ed Sullivan. And, I had no reference point to it or anything. It was just like there was this thing, and I was seeing it and hearing it, and I loved it, but I didn't know why, and I didn't even know what it was. I'm not sure I even knew what music was at that point. But it was just like it was sort of getting punched in the face with it, and so it stuck there. And while I agree, as I got older, I mean, the Kinks are probably pretty close to my favorite band, pretty close. Yeah, I think the people that have those soft and fuzzy feelings for the Beatles are the people that were there when it happened. Because, a lot of people say also that it was right after Kennedy got shot. Everybody was in a bad mood. Everybody was feeling down, and they needed something. I think it just might have been, location.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you can trace a lot of those things. Elvis was kind of the same deal. Yeah. Punk rock later in the 70s, kind of the same deal. The funny thing to me, though, is, I came at all of this stuff after it had already happened.
Me too.
So, for me, like, the stuff that I remember growing up, Phil Collins, Journey, I have absolutely no nostalgia or love for any of that stuff.
None.
So, for me, it's strange to think about, wow, there must have been a time where you could grow up and exciting stuff was happening right then, right there.
Yeah. Well, the radio... my parents listened to the top 40 radio station in Indianapolis, and it was great. I mean, you turned on, the Who, the Kinks, the Hollies, the Beach Boys, Buffalo Springfield, all this stuff. I mean, and none of it sounded the same. It was all different and coming at you at all times. And then, by the end of the 60s, early 70s, FM came along. People started figuring out formats and who they could sell time to who for if they played what. And, radio just became no fun after a while. But there was a time where you get in your car to go to Grandma's house, and it was a musical education the whole way there.
Yeah.
And if people didn't grow up in that era, it's kind of hard to, it's like I tell people, I said, you want to know what it was like before Elvis? Lock yourself in a closet. That's pretty much it. Because here's the weird thing. I asked my mom once, I said, Mom, I said, before Elvis came along, I said, there was a lot of, like, really, really great black music, I mean, there's the Wynonie Harris and Roy Brown and the Five Royales and all this stuff. I said, how come you weren't listening to that stuff? And my mom gave me the weirdest, most honest answer I've ever heard. And she was totally sincere when she said, I didn't know black people made music. That's how segregated it was.
Sure, yeah.
And whenever I hear anybody go on about Elvis, he appropriated black music, he did this, he did that, blah, 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 and I say, look, maybe, but he kicked that door down. He made it possible for Chuck Berry to get some royalties. He made it possible for Little Richard to get some royalties. He made it possible for these people, that were on the Chitlin circuit to start making some actual money. So
sure, yeah.
You can say what you want about Elvis, and also, Elvis had that voice. Nobody else had that voice. And so, people bogan about Elvis don't get very far with me. So, and the weird thing was I only grew up with just a little bit of Elvis, like a smidgen here and there. My mom discovered oldie stations around 1968 or so. And that's kind of when I first started hearing it. When Burning Love came out, I overheard my mom on the phone tell someone. She goes, "Have you heard that new Elvis song? It makes me wet." And I spent the whole day going,
What does that mean?
I'm going, what the, yeah, but that was like the first time I had ever heard, like rock and roll being associated with sex, the very first time, and I was overhearing my mother on the phone. I'm like, But I was with my mom in the car. We were getting school clothes for me when Elvis died, and she just lost it. She just started crying in the car. And at that time, I was just starting to get into punk rock, and I was already into like a lot of metal and stuff. And I just looked at her like, I need pants, right? And I didn't get it till a couple years later.
Right.
But like you said, you grew up with country music in the house, right?
Well, my mom hated it. My mom, she had left Virginia because she wanted a college education, and so she kind of felt obligated to listen to, show tunes or things that she thought was like what educated people listened to. But, my dad, he liked country and blues and rock and roll, and when I started getting into this music, my dad and I started collecting records together, and he would tell me, when I lived in Cincinnati, we used to listen to Wayne Rainey and Lonnie Glosson sell harmonicas on the radio and WCW and things like that, So there was definitely sort of a positive influence for this kind of music from my dad, whereas my mom, God bless her, she was very proud of me for what I did, but she always said, she caught me listening to a Homer and Jethro album once, and she said, we moved out of the hills to get away from Homer and Jethro.
I loved Homer and Jethro when I was a kid. See, the thing was, though, that I did not come from a country background at all. Both of my parents were not the least bit interested in it, and my mother used to actively make fun of it. When she would get the Columbia Records thing for 10 records for a nickel or whatever it was, I remember her going, "Look, Narvel Phelps. There's somebody named Narvel Phelps," and she would just laugh and laugh.
He's from Missouri.
Yeah, and so I didn't grow up with it. I had a Johnny Cash album as a kid, Songs of Our Soil, and I had some Homer and Jethro records, and a couple of Johnny Horton records, and that was it. As far as country music is concerned, it stopped right there.
Yeah.
And the Johnny Horton records, I loved from day one, and I'm pretty sure it was because I was always kind of a history nerd.
Right.
So the one I had was the one that had like Snowshoe Thompson
right.
and Old Slewfoot and stuff on it, and I enjoyed them because not only would I listen to them, but I go, I'm going to look that up. I'm going to see if that's true.
Right.
And I was pretty disappointed when I found out they didn't use a gator for a cannon. But other than that,
I know. I was singing that song to my daughter last week.
Yeah,
and she was entranced by that line.
All kids do. What powder is behind her, like, what are you doing? What, a gator? But but other than that, country was not part of the equation at all until I was about 22 or 23. I had a girlfriend who was going to law school at IU when it was about an hour and a half drive, and that was when I owned a record store. And on my way out, I was grabbing some cassettes to listen to, and I had a cassette of that Hank Williams 24 Greatest was the White Album, the double album. And I was like, I should probably listen to that, see what that's into. So I pop in the car, and I'm driving along, and I'm like going, oh, yeah, I know that song. The next one comes on, I'm like, yeah, I know that song, too. And by the time it was over, I realized that I knew about 2/3 of the songs on that record, having never listened to a Hank Williams album ever in my life. And I realized that maybe there are some songs or some artists whose songs just sort of become so part of the fabric of life that maybe you come out of the womb already knowing them.
It's true.
And I, to a degree, I think there are some Beatles songs that are like that. I'm sure, a kid who's like 5 or 6 years old has probably still heard Yesterday about 10 or 12 times.
Yeah.
By the time they've reached a certain age. And I just remember going, hey, this stuff is pretty good. So I had a guy, and this is like, it's always been like this. I won't like a particular type of music, and then I'll meet someone who likes it a lot. I'd give them a couple of blank cassettes, and I go, okay, here, make me like reggae. Or here, make me like whatever. And I gave this guy a couple of cassettes. He gave me some like Lefty Frizzell and some Buck Owens and stuff like that. And that was it. It was done.
Yeah.
I went to South by Southwest with him the next year, and I think we saw like Gary Stewart, Don Walzer, Wayne Hancock, you know, and at that point I was just like swimming in it.
Yeah.
But I didn't grow up with it at all. I had no reference point for it. It just sort of kind of happened a little later in life. So, but you had it from the beginning.
Well, the interesting thing is, you know, we lived out in the country, and I remember getting this little GE portable record player and a stack of hand-me-down 45s and a couple of albums. There was, you know, the albums were Elvis' Greatest Hits Volume 1,
Right.
Johnny Cash's Greatest Hits Volume 2, a couple other things like that. And then these 45s, it was Jerry Lee Lewis, Paul Revere and the Raiders, the Monkees, you know, Monster Mash.
That was the good stuff back then.
And that was literally like, it wasn't like my family was really into music and I just got these in addition to that. Now, this was literally like my only exposure to music was this stack of records. Because, you know, like I said, my mom would listen to Fiddler on the Roof maybe twice a year, and that was about it. So I just became obsessed with this little stack of records. And it's funny because when I think about it now, that stack of records defined my musical taste for the rest of my life, you know. Yeah. And when I listen to hippie jams, I'm like, wow, I really don't like this. And I wonder, well, what would have happened if they had given me, you know, like Grateful Dead live at the Fillmore East or something like that? Maybe I would have loved that just as much, you know.
Now, how about, I'll just make a quick detour. How about Skeletons in Your Closet? Is there like a band or an album that nobody in the whole world would expect you to like, that you have a soft spot for? Like, if I look between your mattress and Box Springs, am I going to find a Genesis album?
So a minute ago we were talking about when I was growing up, it was, you know, Phil Collins and Journey, and how I had no nostalgia for that. So I have to backtrack a little and say that, you know, being a white male growing up in the Midwest in the early 1980s, there's just no way you can escape without being subjected to not hundreds, tens of thousands of hours of heavy metal music. So to me, when I hear Van Halen, AC/DC, Judas Priest, like that literally is like the music of my youth. Like I remember hanging out with all my friends listening to that stuff. And, you know, I could probably sing every single word to, you know, the first two Van Halen albums. And it's just like you said, I heard it so many times between the ages of 13 and 18 that it's just ingrained in my brain now. I have
the same thing. If you were going to ask me the same question, I would say that if I put myself in the right mindset, I can listen to stuff that I was listening to in 76 and 77 and still enjoy it within the right framework, you know. Because, I mean, for me, like, Alice Cooper's $1 Billion Babies was a huge record. I mean, everybody I knew owned a copy. You know, that first Boston record, everybody I knew had a copy.
Sure.
See, that's the thing is, a lot of people, they think that once they reach a certain point or they start liking a certain thing, that they have to put everything else away, like it doesn't exist anymore. But, you know, when I was growing up, and the reason I'm sure that I have this big power pop fetish is because growing up, I loved those bubblegum singles. You know, like Love Grows Where My Rosemary Goes, or 1, 2, 3 Red Light, all that stuff. I mean, I was really the Sweet. And every time I heard the Sweet, I was like, that's it right there. And that kind of followed me through, because I went through, I had a kind of a weird introduction to punk rock, which I guess we could probably talk about next, because it sounds like you did too. So was the Ramones, was that the first one for you?
Well, so what happened for me was I started playing guitar, and I wanted to play Buddy Holly songs and Elvis songs, and I was the only one around, and everybody thought it was really weird. And so it was kind of around the same time that the Stray Cats happened. So we're talking, you know, 83 to 85. The other guitar players in my town were either heavy metal guys or punk rock guys.
Right.
And I hung out with both of them. They were my pals, but, you know, the problem is the heavy metal guys, they love to do a lot of drugs, and they love to just play endless solos and listen to, like, classical music and all this stuff that I just really wasn't into. Whereas the punk rock guys, it sort of fit more with my 1950s aesthetic. Like, everything was fast, and loud and hard, and the songs were 2.5 minutes
And easy to play.
and easy to play. And you know, the minute that I heard the Ramones, I was like, okay, it's just a very short leap from Eddie Cochran to the first Ramones album.
Easy.
I mean, it's the same 3 chords, you know. So I just fell in love with that stuff. And at that time, every punk rock band in the world was touring through Columbia, Missouri, because it was a college town. So, you know, we saw the Ramones and the Dickies and the Circle Jerks and, you know, you name it. I mean, Black Flag, we saw them all. They toured through there. I'm sure it was probably the same in your town.
Somewhat. Indianapolis didn't get quite as much. The funny story I like to tell is the record store I worked at. We got a phone call one day from the local promoter, and the guy says, he goes, "Hey," he says, "John Cale, that's the guy that does cocaine, right?" And we're like, no, that's J.J. Cale. And we heard him on the phone go, "We got the wrong Cale!" That's Indianapolis in a nutshell. We didn't get a lot of bands. We didn't start getting a lot of bands in the clubs until like the mid '80s. We missed out on a lot of stuff that went. We used to have to drive. We used to have to drive to Chicago or Cincinnati or Lexington, Kentucky to see shows, because very, very rarely, unless they accidentally booked them by mistake, would we get anybody through there of any note. And it used to be, I don't know if it's still like this, but it used to be when the big bands would start their tour, like their first couple of shows would be like, one of them would be like Indianapolis, Cincinnati, and they would do that because they wanted to get the rusty shows out of the way before they hit the big markets where there was lots of press. So Indianapolis is a town that gets no respect whatsoever from the musical establishment. If I remember correctly, I think either Genesis or Pink Floyd refused to play Indianapolis for a long time just because they held a grudge, because they were offered once and they said no. They're like, all right, we're not coming back.
That's funny.
So and when I heard the Ramones the first time, I heard it the first album came out, and I was with my mom and she was getting her hair done, and the record store was next door, and it was $4.81, which made it $5 even with tax, and I just had birthday money, and I said, that's that band my uncle tells me I should listen to. So I bought it and I took it home, I put it on, and I'm like, all right, that's pretty good. And the next song came on, and I was like, oh man, that sounds just like the first song. I think this might be a defective copy. They might have given me one that's got the same song on every groove. So I kept playing. I was like, oh no, wait a minute, the words are different. And it was a process. I kept playing it. Kept playing it, and by the end of the night, I was jumping up and down on the bed. So
it must have sounded different to fresh ears back then.
It did. Do you remember how fast it sounded? I mean, now you listen to it and you're like, that's not nearly as fast as I remember it sounding. But that, and then it just became I don't know how for you, we didn't have any record stores where I could buy this stuff, so I had to go get a trouser press every month. Go to the back where the classifieds were, and I'd say, oh, okay, that one looks good. It's only $2, so I'd kind of, And the funny thing is, a lot of these were I got the first Devo single, on whatever the Bougie Boy label or whatever it was, and you would sometimes get handwritten notes. They'd go hey, thanks for buying my record, and it was just sort of a fun time. And like you were talking about earlier, about the punk crew and the heavy metal crew, is the punk crew had a larger umbrella. If you were doing a little surf in your punk, or if you were doing a little R&B in your punk, or if you were doing a little reggae in your punk, that umbrella was there for you. Cool. But if you're one of these metal dudes and you say, hey, how about we do a ballad, you're probably going to get beat up. So that was kind of what brought me into it too, because as a kid I was exposed to a lot of different stuff. I had an uncle who gave me albums all the time, and I'm 8 years old and I've got a copy of Having a Rave Up with the Yardbirds, and that's not a bad start really. So that was it. That was it for me. I came into it kind of early. But being in Indianapolis, it was very, very lonely. So, and I didn't have these two different groups. I had two friends and the three of us were just kind of listening to this stuff on our own. I wore a Blondie shirt to school once, and nobody knew who it was.
That's funny.
Yeah, I tell you right there. So, when did you start playing guitar? Pretty early?
Well, I started when I was 13 years old, and following up with your story of having your couple of friends, I had my one rockabilly friend, and it was a guy named Rabid Rick. And
Rabid or Rabbit?
Rabid.
Okay.
And Rabid Rick Carter. So I really wanted to get a rockabilly band together, like the Stray Cats,
Right.
you know. And there was an ad in the paper. I don't even think it was the daily paper. It was like the little free ad sheet kind of paper. And it said, you know, wanted to form rockabilly band. And so I met up with this guy, and he was just a singer. He couldn't play any instruments, but he wasn't a very good singer. But he had a full-on pompadour, and he had his whole Elvis shrine in his house. One of my favorite stories is that he was so obsessed with Elvis that he went to Memphis, and that back in the old days of Memphis, you could go to all these sort of cash-in places across the street from Graceland, and one of them had Elvis's limousine that you could go sit in. And so my friend Rabid Rick had gotten in the back seat of the limousine and shoved his hand in between the seat cushions, and he had pulled out this Red Hot, you know, a little Red Hot candy. And so when I met Rabid Rick, he lived in a trailer, in this trailer court. The centerpiece of his trailer was this framed Red Hot that had came from Elvis's limousine. And he had, this is Elvis's Red Hot. And so, you know, we immediately became friends, and we would drive around in his station wagon. This is before I could drive. We'd drive around in his station wagon listening to 8 tracks of rockabilly that he had recorded, you know, because he had an 8-track recorder, which was pretty rare back in those days.
That was pretty rare.
So eventually we figured out, like, the only way we're going to get a band together is if he played drums. So I played guitar, he played drums, and we used a blues guy on bass for a while. Then we had a bluegrass guy who actually had an upright bass, you know, we had that for a while. And that was my first band, the Rockin' Tailfins. And I was probably 14, 15 years old when we got that off the ground.
Now, around what time did you meet Dave Stuckey?
Well, that was much later.
Oh, much later.
Stuckey was from Kansas City. The first time that I ever met him was when my band, the Untamed Youth, toured out here in California in, I think, 1990. And I got his number, and when I moved out to California, I started calling him about, hey, we should get together and play. And so that's how we sort of got but I actually never hung out with him until I came out to California in 1991. He's been out here since the early 80s, and I moved out in 91.
It's not now. How did you go from the Tailfins to the Untamed Youth?
So the rockabilly thing at that time, I don't know if there was anything like this in Indianapolis, but because of the Stray Cats actually having hits, you could get booked. So the Rockin' Tailfins were playing all over the place. We were playing pizza joints and, you know, restaurants and bars and lodges, and I was playing all the time, probably more than I am now. I mean, we weren't making any money, but we were playing.
Right.
And then almost just as quickly as it happened, it was kind of like, that was passé. That was like last year's fad, you know. And we had a local record store, and I was also working at this radio station named KOPN. And it was right around the time that I got hooked up with Billy and Miriam from Norton Records in New York.
Right.
At the time, they were putting out Kicks Magazine, and I was devouring every sentence of Kicks Magazine, trying to learn all about this kind of music. And they were one of the first people I ever saw who wrote about 50s rockabilly and 60s garage. And in, you know, the world of Kicks Magazine, those two things were interchangeable and cool.
Right.
And so when the first Back from the Grave compilation came out, I remember that came into the local record store, probably, I would guess, 85 or 86, something like that, and I bought it, and I was hooked. I was like, wow, this stuff is great, I love it. And so when the Rockin' Tailfins broke up, I thought, man, you know, the 60s garage stuff is really easy to play. So I could probably get some of these guys that I go to high school with to play this kind of music, and we can form a band, and then that way we don't have to chase this elusive dream of finding a guy who can slap the upright bass, you know. So that was kind of the concept of the Untamed Youth. It was just guys that I was in high school with, and we formed, and we were mostly doing 60s garage type stuff. And I heard a few surf songs, and I thought, well, I like playing surf guitar, it's really cool, and so we would throw in a few of those in the set. And when we eventually hooked up with Billy Miller, and they were starting Norton Records around that time, around 1986, 87, he told us, he said, you know, there's just been a million bands that have already done this 60s garage thing to death, Like you guys are covering Sometimes Good Guys Don't Wear White by the Standells. It's a great song, but there's literally been 30 bands cover that song. So you got to do something to make yourself unique. And he said, the one thing you guys do that nobody else is doing is this surf thing. You guys should just focus on that. And he made us some cassette compilations of really obscure things.
Cassettes were so helpful.
They were. And so we went back and we sort of turned ourselves into a surf band. And we would still do the occasional garage thing, but it became less about covering songs that were on Back from the Grave and Pebbles compilations. And then our first album came out, I think, in 1989 on Norton Records. And that group, we were together really as a band from 1987 until 1993. We moved
that long?
We moved out here in 1991 and never really got it going out here. We never could find the right guys to play with.
Right.
But we sort of kept going until 93. That was when Mace moved back to Missouri, and that was the official end of the Untamed Youth. But then, starting in 95, we've been doing reunion shows every year, so it's not really like we broke up.
Right. Because I would say now there's probably as many surf bands as there were 60s garage bands now. I mean, there's so much.
I know.
Much surf out there now.
What's funny is that we broke up in 93, right as Pulp Fiction was breaking.
Oh.
And by the end of 93, there was a surf band on every block, and it was like they were using surf music and all these commercials on TV, and Mace had moved back to Missouri, and I was out here going, well, timing was sure off on that one.
And that's how I learned how to play drums with surf music.
Yeah.
I was never a good drummer. I'm not claiming to be a drummer, but Red River Rock is the first song I ever played all the way through from beginning to end.
Yeah.
So, and I always tell people that are starting with drums, I say, look, surf music is a great place to start because it's fairly simple, but you still have to keep the beat, and there's plenty of time for those fun rolls.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're just starting out, I think that's a really good way to start.
Well, the funny thing is that when I started going to garage sales in Missouri, there was a ton of surf records at garage sales in Missouri, which you would not think. But I picked up, a lot of the Lively ones and the Surfaris and even Dick Dale and stuff like that, and of course tons of Ventures albums in Missouri. So that, that was right around the same time we were starting the band. And it was like, you're playing that stuff constantly over and over. It just goes into your brain.
Sure. Well, what I heard, and this may or may not be true, but back in my record collecting days, I heard that you could find more surf music in the Midwest than on the coast because people in the Midwest didn't have the sunshine and the beach and the sand. They could only dream about it. So it was kind of like a fantasy thing. People would get these records and just dream of being in California.
Well, it's the same thing with Hawaiian records.
Yeah.
You find those Hawaiian records everywhere because people had that fantasy of going to Hawaii.
So you've come out here. The Untamed Youth has folded. And are you kind of trying to figure out what to do next, or did you have an idea of what you wanted to do next?
Well, it was funny because when I moved out to California, it was January 1991, and the idea was to get the Untamed Youth going. And that never really happened out here, as I mentioned. We never could find the right drummer. We never could find the right organ player. It was just half the band that moved out here.
Right.
At the same time, I'm seeing this huge rockabilly thing happening. There's these big crowds at all these rockabilly shows. One of the first gigs, or one of the first jobs I ever got was working at this place called the Blue Saloon in North Hollywood. And I was the sound guy. I was the door guy. I just would do anything, and I worked there 6 or 7 days a week. And so they would have bands like Big Sandy and the Fly Ride Trio, James Entbell, Russell Scott, a few of the bands kind of left over from the 80s rockabilly thing that had happened out here. And they had these huge crowds, And I was like, wow, I've always loved rockabilly, but I never thought it was possible. Mm-hmm. And then seeing bands like Big Sandy play, it's totally possible, and there's this scene for it out here. So I started thinking, well, maybe I want to start playing rockabilly again. And around that same time, I struck up a friendship with Dave Stuckey, and he was kind of a drummer, sort of a drummer. Mm-hmm. He actually wound up saving the Untamed Youth for the last year that we were out here by playing drums for us. And during that time, we kept talking about, hey, we should get a band together. Let's do something that's like more on the hillbilly side of rockabilly and do duets, you know, like Louvin Brothers, Delmore Brothers, that kind of a thing. And so we formed this band, the Dave and Deke Combo, and we actually started playing gigs around June or July of 1991, but it took a couple of years to really get the lineup cemented. And then from about, 93 until 96, we played and toured and made records and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
So that was really sort of the next phase for me was doing that.
Right. Now, the first record was Moonshine Melodies, right?
Yeah.
Okay. And then I didn't hear that one when it came out. I didn't hear you guys until the second record.
Well, unless you were one of the lucky 300 people, you didn't hear that one when it came out.
Yeah, but it was the second one. It was Hollywood Barn Dance. That was the source of the short phone call that we had. Because the Ledge had just played someplace in Los Angeles, and we were all in the car together taking him back to San Francisco and or San Jose. And we were talking about this new record that we had heard. We were like, oh man, this record is like, it's killer. Blah, 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 blah. And then Joey goes, well, what are you talking about? We're going to get him from Hollywood Barn Dance. He goes, oh, my buddy Deke.
Yeah.
He gets out his phone. And he just hands. He goes, say hello to Deke.
That's funny.
Alcohol was involved. And I go, huh? And then he just pulls it away. Hey, man, we're just talking about your record. I don't know if you remember this or not. And then he was like, okay, see ya. And it was like 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm sure he must have woken you up. But me and a lot of the people I hang out with, and don't take this the wrong way, because I mean it in the most complimentary fashion I can muster, is we kind of think that Hollywood Barn Dance is like the Sgt. Pepper of hillbilly records. Okay, I mean it really is. There's not a bum song on it.
I'll take that. Yeah,
honestly, it's one of my very favorite country records.
But there's a lot of bum songs on Sgt. Pepper. Let's be honest.
I meant it in a complimentary fashion. It was just that's what we were talking about when he called you. We were specifically talking about that record, and I can tell you that record is seen as a very special record to a lot of people.
Well, I still hear that. That makes me happy. And it was funny because, that record came out in 95 or 96. It was really right before the band broke up. And that was kind of still when the record industry was the real record industry.
Right.
And so we got signed to this label in San Francisco, and the guy was trying to promote it like a real record. Mm-hmm. The only problem was it sounded like something from 1952. So, I remember when BR549 got signed to RCA, mm-hmm. They weren't on RCA. I can't remember what label BR549 got signed to, but I got a letter from RCA asking me to please send them the new Dave and Deke album so they could review it. Mm-hmm. And I sent him a copy, and I never heard back from him. So, it's kind of a double-edged sword. We made this great record that really did have that vintage sound, the 1952 sound that we were going for. But at the same time, you couldn't get something like that played on the radio. You couldn't really sell more than 1,000 copies of it, So it was what it was. I'm still proud of it to this day, But it was just funny trying to watch a record label try to sell something like that,
Right.
And I had similar problems when I was on High Tone Records a few years later, mm-hmm. under my own name. It's like they wanted modern sounding records that could get played on the radio, and I just kept thinking, yeah, but those records sound terrible. I don't want to make a modern sounding rockabilly record.
And plus, you don't want to do what you don't do. I mean,
Well, that's just it. It's you want to do what you like and what you feel is the right way to do things.
Yeah.
And, maybe there's guys who do modern rockabilly and they're so convinced of it that they can make a powerful modern rockabilly record that doesn't sound wrong or bad. Mm-hmm. But that's not me,
Right, exactly. It's kind of like that scene in Ghost World.
Right.
Remember where they go see the,
if you love authentic
blues hammer is like really good. Yeah, I mean, I laugh at that scene like I laugh at the Stonehenge scene in Spinal Tap. It just makes me laugh every time. That look on Steve Buscemi's face where he's just like, oh.
And everybody around him is partying.
Yes. I remember when you guys broke up, I was actually oh no, not really. What I read about it, it didn't sound like there was any sort of rancor or anything. Was it just like you all decided that it was time?
Well, there was a bit of rancor, but all these years later, it's not really worth mentioning. If I had to really, because I'm the one that quit the band,
Mm-hmm.
and really what it came down to is I wanted to do music full time,
Right.
and I also wanted to call the shots. And being in a democratic band where all four guys had an equal say, just really wasn't where I wanted to be.
Right.
And there was a few situations out on the road where it was like, oh man, this is not really the way that I want to do things. And, at the end of the day, all these years later, it's like, it's not really their fault. It's not really my fault. It's just that band was never really destined to stay together and
Right.
tour and do all those things,
Well, the road can kill a band quicker than just about anything.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're in the same band with the same people day in and day out for a certain amount of time,
Right.
something's going to happen.
Yeah. So, I basically just quit the band and became very unpopular around LA for a while because people were really unhappy that I had broken up their favorite band. And it was funny, it took me about a year and a half to get guys to actually play with me and form the Echophonics, And now all these years later, it's like we do Dave and Deke reunions. Everything's fine. Everything's cool. Everybody likes each other. It's no big deal,
That's almost, that's almost better. If you can have friends that you can play with occasionally when you're not doing your own thing.
Right.
And also, I mean, you were also starting to get into production a little bit too, weren't you?
Yeah.
I mean, there was a lot of people asking you to produce their stuff, wasn't there?
Yeah.
So I would imagine having a full-time band and doing that would have been kind of difficult.
Well, ultimately at the end of the day, being in a band it's just the worst idea possible, where everybody has an equal say. I mean, after all these years of being on the road, I can speak with honesty in saying that you really need a fearless leader who takes all the risks and makes sure everybody else gets paid.
Right.
But you need somebody calling the shots and somebody saying, no, we're going to do it this way. Because otherwise you just spend your entire time bickering with these 2 or 3 or 4 other guys about, no, I think we should do it this way. No, I think we should do it this way. And most of the professional situations that I've run into over the decades, it's always been there's a benevolent dictator in charge,
Yeah.
And you look at a band like Reverend Horton Heat, it's like, that guy took on so many risks early in the career. He gave those guys a weekly paycheck, but then if the band broke down, he took the hit,
Right.
like he had to pay for it out of his pocket. And now all these years later, it's like, yeah, there's absolutely no question. Like, Jim is in charge because Jim took all those risks in the early years and he made sure everybody got paid. And so I always look to people like that as sort of the example of how I wanted to do things. And that's pretty much how I've done things since I formed the Echophonics.
Right. Well, I've told people in the past, because I've been in several bands that broke up under acrimonious circumstances, and I just tell them, if you can imagine being married to 3 people at the same time.
Yeah, 3 dudes.
Yeah, 3 dudes. then that's kind of what it's like, and it's tough. It's tough to explain to people that haven't done it. But and then you put them all in a van, and then everything becomes magnified. So
it's funny. I won't mention names, but a friend of mine formed a band a few years ago, and it was a democracy. And so then he kept going through all these problems, and I was like, dude, this is the exact same problem I had with, the Untamed Youth or the Dave and Deke combo back in the 80s or the early 90s. And then they wanted to put out a record, and so each guy was supposed to come up with 1/4 of the amount of money it was going to take. And there was that one guy who wouldn't come up with the money because his girlfriend made him promise to take her on a vacation. And I was like, dude, this is never going to work. You've got to strike down the democracy. And of course, now several years later, like, that's exactly what happened.
Yeah. Okay, so you were unpopular in town, you say, for a while?
Oh, man.
People were actually like...
People hated my guts, yeah, because I broke up the Dave and Deke combo.
A lot of internet hate? Or was this before?
This is really like the early days of the internet. I remember being on the internet in 1996, but there wasn't Facebook or any of those kind of things, you know. I remember when I first started my band, there was a guy that flew in from England, there was a guy that flew in from Michigan to try out for the band, and you know, I wound up getting an English drummer who was a buddy of mine that moved over, and then a couple other guys from here in LA. And you know, once we started playing out, it was fine. Everybody was cool with it. But there for a while, there was like a definite, like, don't play with Deke. He broke up the Dave and Deke combo.
Now, with this, because Joey Myers said he played with you for a short amount of time.
Yeah.
Has this been around that time?
Well, we had been around for a year or two at that point. The tour that he did with me was we were doing a tour with Mike Ness from Social Distortion as the opening band. And it was a pretty high-profile tour for us. And the drummer that had committed to doing the tour, his wife told him he couldn't do it after we had done the first 2 shows. So then all of a sudden it was like, we have 47 more shows on this tour. And I called up Joey just out of the blue. I said, dude, we need you to go like tomorrow. And he said, okay. And you know, I love Joey, so he just hopped in the van. We went, we had a great time, and I've done scattered shows with him over the years since then, but that was the only real time that I spent time on the road with him.
I'm going to start right back up with something that I meant to ask during the Untamed Youth, or no, during the Dave and Deke portion, is Steppenwolf.
Yeah.
You opened for Steppenwolf.
We did. Dave and Deke really didn't do that much national touring. I think we did 2 really long national tours. And it might have been right after you saw us in Chicago. We played in my hometown, Columbia, Missouri. You know, my folks were still there. And we did a show just on our own. And we had the night off, or the next night off. And then we were supposed to go to Kansas City or Lawrence or something like that. And the owner of the Blue Note said, well, you know, I got Steppenwolf tomorrow night, and my opening band canceled. If you guys want to open up for Steppenwolf, I'll give you $200. And we thought, well, we're going to be in town with my folks anyway. Let's just do it. And it was hilarious because they had so much equipment on stage, none of which could be moved, of course.
Right.
That the little circle where Dave and Deke could set up all our stuff was literally as small as this dining room table. And we were just right there in the middle of it, you know. And the crowd loved us, you know. They were just a bunch of rednecks and bikers, and they love all that hillbilly kind of crap, you know. But as far as the oddest double bill in my entire career, that might have been it.
Yeah, I mean, up until when I read that today, the oddest double bill I could think of was when the Dictators opened for Uriah Heep. Yeah, I didn't see that show, but I sure would have liked to have.
Yeah.
Now, shortly after you put out your first solo album, I actually saw you again. You played I think a hotel or something in Indianapolis. I never remember venues.
Well, there used to be that indie, you know, rockabilly weekend thing.
Right.
And I played that a few times, actually.
This was a solo show. It was at a, and actually I didn't know you were in Indianapolis like last month.
I was, yeah.
Yeah, I didn't know it until like the day after.
It's kind of the same. Apparently, after that indie rockabilly weekend thing quit going, why am I blanking out on the name of that thing I just played? This guy sort of took it over. So it's kind of at the same time every year, and it's the same crowd. It's a lot of people I remember from that.
All right.
The Road Rocket Rumble, thank you.
Well, I will try to remember that next year. Because, yeah, I was flipping through Facebook, and it was right after this tour that you took with your dad.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I want to talk about that, too. That was absolutely... See, my family doesn't have any sort of... my grandma was adopted. Mm-hmm. So as far as looking back is concerned, it kind of stops right there. There's nowhere we can look back. But it looks like you have a pretty good view of your family history.
It's really amazing to me because even my dad didn't really know about it. Mm-hmm. You know, growing up in Floyd County, Virginia, he was aware that they had been there for a long time. And then with the advent of all these kind of genealogy websites and everything, I went back there in January after my mom passed away, and I was like, wow, there's actually like 6 generations of Dickersons going straight back to this guy who's a Revolutionary War soldier, and they're all buried like within, you know, a 15-mile radius of each other. And that was kind of a revelation to me because I had no idea that it went that far back. And then when my dad and I did this trip last month, He didn't even know that. I took him to see the Revolutionary War soldier, this guy
Uh-huh.
Moses Dickerson Sr., and he's, wow, we never came here when I was a kid. I didn't even know it was here.
And so you guys basically just went and visited like various family places of interest and saw people you haven't seen in a while? And...
Well, Floyd County, Virginia is a really sort of isolated place. Back when, in the 70s, when I was a kid, it was like, you know, the middle of nowhere,
Right.
Appalachian Mountains. Nowadays, it's kind of cosmopolitan because a lot of people from D.C. and other places have bought land there because it's so pretty, and they actually have, you know, a big music festival there, and they have this place called the General Store where they have this big jamboree with bluegrass and that kind of music every Friday night. But when he was growing up, you know, it was just a little hillbilly town. And so he wanted to go back there and just see the people that were still alive,
Right.
and just see some of these places again that he hadn't seen for a long time. And he kept saying it was his last time he was ever going back to Floyd, Virginia. But then as soon as we were done with the trip, he's like, you know, we ought to go back next year. Okay, Pop.
Well, just judging from, you know, the pictures that you posted, it looks like you were having a blast.
Yeah, it was great. I really enjoyed it.
I got a list of names here, and,
Well,
it's, like,
you
and
know-
it's like so incomplete. I'm sure. But what I was going to say was, you know, and you may disagree, but I kind of think that being able to tell people that you were friends with Scotty Moore or having a phone message from Scotty Moore is really better than having a house in Malibu.
Well, to me it is, yeah.
Career-wise, I mean, you have been able to hang out with some of the coolest people. I mean,
And that started with the whole Dave and Deke thing, you know, because the bass player of the Dave and Deke combo managed the club where I was working at, the Blue Saloon,
Uh-huh.
and he was really into, hey, let's bring in 50s rockabilly guys and we'll back them up. And so there's all these 50s rockabilly guys came out and played, and then once I got the Echophonics going, continued doing that, and you know, like you said, after all these years, I look back at it, it's like, wow, I got to play with just about every single one, you know. There's only a handful that I never got to play with. But now that people like Scotty Moore are gone,
right.
it seems like some kind of crazy fever dream. Like, dude, I was friends with Scotty Moore.
I know.
You
I
know?
know.
How is that even possible?
Yeah, I just I remember the first time I got a phone message from T-Bone Burnett. I kept playing it over and over again. I was like going, "Hey, look, T-Bone Burnett left me a message," but I couldn't imagine getting a phone call from Scotty Moore. That I would probably faint. Like for instance, Claude Chenier or Claude Trenier, excuse me. How did the Treniers play that club?
Well, the Treniers used to play all the time in Vegas, and the first time I ever saw him was when the Untamed Youth came to California for the first time, which I think was 88 or 89. We drove through Las Vegas, my first time in Vegas. Treniers are playing, you know. Walk in, there's the Treniers. They're playing. It's like they've been playing on stage almost every night since 1947,
Right.
and here it's, 1989. They're still up there doing 4 hours a night. And when Viva Las Vegas started happening, Treniers are playing, you know. I mean, at that time, Cliff had been dead for a while, but Claude, who was the other twin, was sort of keeping the band alive.
Right.
And Claude was just the funniest dude ever. Just the funniest guy you ever met. And I've heard, I never met Cliff, but I've heard that Cliff was even funnier.
Right. Well, I met Claude actually. I have a funny Trenier story that I was saving for you.
Okay.
We were going. It was like about 1983 or 84, and we drove to Chicago to see Susie and the Banshees. Okay, it was kind of past their prime, but we
Well,
never
any story
seen
where you
them
could
and-
mix Susie and the Banshees and the Treniers is a good one.
Right. Well, so we're going on Lakeshore Drive, and we're passing Milt Trenier's Lounge. And we look up, it says, "Tonight, the Treniers, blah, 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 blah." And we're like, "Oh, man, if I'd known that, I'd much rather have seen that." And we noticed that there was a late show. So we said, well, when this show's over, let's go see if we can catch the late show. Susie and the Banshees were not only just horrible, but they actually made me stop liking a certain type of music, like right then and there. They came out late, they were rude, they played really bad, backs were turned to us, they never said a word, no encore, just everything bad about the show was displayed right there. So we're like, let's go see the Treniers, I want to feel good. So we go to Milt Treniers. Look, I'm probably wearing some baggy shorts and an Eraserhead t-shirt, and I don't know what the rest of the guys are wearing. We go up to the counter, and the guy just looks at us like, and so, we came to see the Turniers. The guy was like, this is a supper club, right? We're like, well, we just want to see the Turniers. And the guy said, I can't let you in. And I said, why? Just because of the way we're dressed? He said, yeah, this is a supper club. And we're like, that's when I decided to lay it on thick. I said, dude, we drove all the way from Indiana just to see the Turniers. Are you really going to turn us away? We didn't know there was a dress code. And so he goes and gets the manager, who I guess was probably Milt. And he goes, like this. And I said, okay. So they take us to the farthest table in the back corner of the room. They take the candle off of the table. A guy gets up on a stool and unscrews the light bulb from over our table. So
That's
we're
awesome.
we're sitting in total darkness in the back. So the Turniers come on, and we had just gotten that compilation that came out on Edsel.
Right.
Really good compilation,
Yeah.
Rockin' Is Our Business. So we had all those songs. We're, get out of the car! Poontang! We're like yelling these things, and they're looking. They can't see us, but they're looking in the back going like, where is all that commotion coming from? Because nobody else was yelling anything.
Yeah.
We're just yelling these songs. So when they were done, they came back and found us, and they bought us a drink, and they were asking us all these questions. They didn't even know that Edsel compilation was out.
Wow.
It was just like, apparently, somebody else owned the songs and decided to do it. But
Yeah.
yeah, that was like really one of the great nights of my life.
That's awesome.
It was the light bulb that made me realize that I'd rather be entertained than look at people who think they're cool.
Right.
So,
Well, and I always loved the Turniers just because, to me, I've always loved stuff with a good sense of humor.
oh yeah,
And so for me, the Turniers was a no-brainer. Everything they did was funny.
yeah, and
and-
hopping. I mean, I like that fast, that peppy.
So just to answer your question about how I hooked up with Claude, when I got signed to High Tone Records, I actually had a budget.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, the first thing that came to mind was, well, I want to spend like a little bit of money recording the music, but then since I have this budget, I want to pay some of my heroes to appear on this record.
Right.
So I'm like, I want to get Larry Collins and I want to get, Claude Trenier. And so I did that on my first two High Tone albums. Like I spent easily half the budget just like getting some of my heroes to play on them.
Right.
So I had this budget, and I went through the Treniers management, and I said, I just want to get Claude to do a spoken word introduction because I'm covering Poontang on this album. And so he's like, okay, Claude's up for it, give him $200 or whatever, and here's his phone number. And I called him. He said, yeah, come on over. So I think I was playing in Vegas, and I drove over to his apartment, and he lived in a very modest apartment. And when I went in there, he's like, yeah, it's kind of a crappy place, but I spent all my money on Keno, and sure enough, if you ever hung out with him at a show, whenever they took a break, man, he just went right over to the Keno table, and he's just playing the Keno, but he was great, like, hey, let's do the spoken word thing, let's get some photographs. He was awesome. I loved that guy, and I wish he was still around today because, when guys like that go, you can't really convey to other people like how great they were.
Right.
You can listen to those records, but you can't really understand how great Claude Trenier was unless you hung out with him.
Right.
I mean, the whole time I was there at his place, I thought I was going to pee my pants. I was laughing so hard,
Now, I'm for me anyway, since I started doing this, I have sort of a list of people that I kind of wish I had been able to talk to, who of course I'm not going to be able to because they're gone. I assume you have a similar list. Are there people that you wish you had worked with or met that you didn't?
Well, the only the only three people that I never got to play with that I wish I could have are Little Richard, Jerry Lee Lewis, and Chuck Berry. And I could still potentially play with Jerry Lee Lewis. It's probably not going to happen. But, unfortunately, like with Chuck Berry, every time I saw him in my lifetime, starting from the 80s through the 90s to a few years ago, it was so bad.
I know.
It was like, I don't know if I really want to be on stage for this train wreck, But man, you go down from there, it's like, man, I got to play with just about everybody else you can think of.
You met Joe Mathis?
I never got to meet Joe Mathis. I don't really count the guys that were dead before I was playing, Never got to meet Merle Travis, but I got to play with the Collins kids,
Let's see now. I had some other ones here. Oh! You just recently played with Doug Kershaw.
I did. That was a huge thrill.
I was about to say that must have been huge.
Well, and even better, for years. I mean, ever since we formed Dave and Deke, we had been doing Rusty and Doug songs.
Mm-hmm.
And we had thought, man, how great would it be if you could talk Doug Kershaw into doing a set of all 50s rockabilly and hillbilly Rusty and Doug stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And for those of you listening who aren't familiar with that, when Doug Kershaw first started his career, he had a duet act with his brother Rusty, and they were called Rusty and Doug. And a lot of the really great rockabilly things like Hey May and even the first versions of Louisiana Man and Diggy Diggy Low, they were actually released under Rusty and Doug. But, later Doug had his very successful solo career, and he kind of wasn't doing those songs. It was just something we always talked about. How great would that be? Mm-hmm. And finally we talked to somebody that, I remember how it went. A friend of ours, Tom Kinney, who is the voice of SpongeBob SquarePants, took a taxi cab here in L.A., and they got to talking about music, and the guy driving the cab said, yeah, my dad was a musician. And he said, well, really, what's your dad's name? Doug Kershaw. So he got this in through Doug's son, and we went and saw him at the Simi Valley Cajun Festival, and we just said, look, Doug, would you be willing to do like a set of the Rusty and Doug material, like all 50s rockabilly stuff? He's like, oh man, I love them songs. I would love to do it. And we did this show at Viva Las Vegas this year, and it was fantastic. I can't even tell you how great it was.
I saw the pictures, and look, that the thing is, I follow you on Facebook, not in a creepy way, but you're one of my favorite people because you always post these pictures that are like not politics and they're not cats, and and it's always something interesting, and the saga of Johnny Horton Stereo just absolutely had me mesmerized for weeks. I was like going, oh man. I was so happy you finally found a way to get it back here.
Yeah.
Because something like that is, I'm really into. I'm a history guy. I'm really into the history of things and stuff like that. It just floats my boat. Back to folks I wanted to ask you about too. Roy Head.
Yeah.
He's one of my big favorites. I think his version of Who Do You Love might just be my favorite version. I don't know if you've probably heard it, but it's got the most wild, manic drums going on in the background.
Yeah.
It's like 3 times as fast as it probably should be.
I've played it with him many times.
Oh, man.
I'm familiar with that version.
So, what's he like?
Well, Roy Head is crazy, as you might expect, in a very good way. And I have to say that I learned so much from the very first show that I ever did with Roy Head. It was at one of those Ponderosa Stomp festivals. And it was pretty anticipated thing for Roy Head to come and do this set of his 60s material.
Right.
So we had this huge crowd. Everybody's waiting for Roy. Everybody's pressed up against the stage. Band is on stage, ready to go. Roy's late. He shows up 10 minutes late. Crowd goes wild. And he puts on the most energetic, exciting show. He's dancing, he's doing the splits, he's doing these microphone spinning tricks. He can throw a microphone at a woman's face and catch the cable right when it's a quarter inch from her nose.
He's got to be in his 60s or 70s, right?
At that point, I think he was still in his 60s. This would have been 2004, 2005, something like that. It was the first time I ever played with him.
I was in my 20s.
And we had prepared about 10 songs, He does 5 songs. Then he does the alligator, which if you don't know, that's where you get down on the ground and you writhe like an alligator. And he does the alligator on his belly through the crowd, and he's gone. And that was it. 5 songs. It was 20 minutes, maybe. And it was one of the greatest shows I've ever been part of. It was great. Unbelievable. It was and it was like everything about that was perfect. You show up late, you kick ass, you leave, everybody's talking about it. And I've done a bunch of shows with Roy over the years, and it's always unpredictable. You never know what's going to happen. You never know which version of Roy is going to show up. But he's so good, man. I love that guy. I love him to death.
He's someone I think should have had more success than he did.
When you're talking about wild and crazy Southern guys, it's always like, whether you're talking about Jerry Lee Lewis or Charlie Rich or any of those kind of guys, Roy Head is certainly like this. they should have had more success, but then at the same time, it's surprising that they had any success at all. Because they were really too wild for mainstream. You know what I mean?
Sure.
I mean, a guy like Roy Head is like, you know, he's like a wild boar, you know? And you try putting a guy like that in some place like, you know, Manhattan or Chicago or San Francisco,
Right.
like that doesn't really work, you know? That works fine in Houston, you know what I mean? But I love Roy. I wish that I could play with Roy a lot more than I have.
Okay, so the Trash Man.
Yeah.
How did that come about?
Boy, that was a hard one. That was difficult because, you know, they're from Minneapolis, they're from Minnesota, and the one thing that I've learned about people from Minnesota is they're friendly. You know, the outside thing is friendly, but unless you're one of the inner circle, you don't really get in.
Uh-huh.
And so, you know, I was obsessed with the Trashmen. They're like one of my favorite bands of all time.
Surfing Bird is easily in my top 5 favorite records.
Surfing Bird is my number 1 favorite record of all time. It really is. And so when they started coming around, I remember the first time I saw them, they played at the Las Vegas Grind Festival in 1999.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, they signed autographs and everything, but just trying to talk to them and everything, you could not penetrate that shell. And at that time, they really had no idea that there was all these young kids listening to the Trashmen.
Right.
They were like trying to figure out what was going on. Why are all these young kids asking us for these obscure songs of ours from the early 60s, you know? And then when they all retired, they started touring around and playing some more. And I saw them several times, and I would always try to engage with them. And it was difficult because it's the Minnesota thing. It's like they're their own... what's the word I'm looking for? You know, it's like the northern version of the Hatfields and the McCoys. Like they hang out, they hang out with their own clan, you know. And finally, I booked them at my Guitar Geek Festival, and I think it was 2010 or 11. I can't remember which year it was. And I wrote in the contract, I said, I must perform Surfin' Bird with the Trashmen. And they're like, no, we've never had anybody sing Surfin' Bird with us except an actual member of the Trashmen.
Right.
And I said, well, that's got to be the deal. I insist. And I guess they had seen some YouTube videos of me doing it and stuff, and so they said, well, okay, look, we want to do the festival, we'll come out and we'll do it, but we have to audition you. Right? So for sound check, I get up there, you know, and it's like, everybody's heard about the bird, and we do it, and they're like, okay, that was great. Sounded just like the record. You can do it tonight at the show. And I was like, yes! And after we did it, Tony, the guitar player, even gave me like a little award that he had bought at the gift shop, you know, at the hotel. And he's like, you did a really good job. Nobody has ever sung that with us except an actual member of the Trashmen, so congratulations. And I kind of thought that was going to be it. Like that was my time. I got to sing Surfin' Bird with the Trashmen. And then I suggested to Tony and Dal, I said, man, it's a crime that you guys are out here playing and there's no new recordings. You know, they did one album that escaped. It wasn't really released, you know, back in the late 80s, and that was it. You know, and I thought, it's just a crime these guys aren't recording. Let's go in the studio and do a record together, thinking they would say no.
Right.
That sounds like a great idea. Let's do it. So the next thing you know, I'm flying out to Minnesota. We're recording some songs in a studio, and I love the recordings that we did. As a Trashmen fan, I'm like, man, I'm just so happy we got them in the studio again.
Yeah, I like it. I think it sounds exactly like it should.
Well, and you know, the funny thing, I've told people this. The thing about the 60s bands that a lot of people don't realize is that they all had their unique DNA and they all had a unique sound based on those four guys interacting with each other. Mm-hmm. Whether you're talking about the Beatles or the Stones or the Trashmen, it's all dependent on it being those guys. And so when I recorded with the Trashmen, I was playing guitar, but I found that a lot of times if I left my guitar in the mix, it didn't sound like the Trashmen anymore. When I took my guitar totally out of the mix, all of a sudden it sounded like the Trashmen. Mm-hmm. So on a lot of these recordings that I did with them, I basically only appear for solos that I take. Otherwise, I take myself out of the mix because it sounds like the Trashmen. It's Tony Dow and Bob Reed. Like, those two guitars and that bass together sound like the Trashmen.
Yep.
And I'm really proud of that record. I think it came out really good.
Yeah, I do too.
You have to be a Trashmen fan to think that, but
I was already there. Look, even Bird Dance Pete, I'm down with all of them. So now here's something slightly serious. I'm kind of curious about for my own sake is I know that you have diabetes.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? So do I. How do you reconcile road food with that?
Well,
be honest.
I'm a little overweight, and you can probably relate. And
I'm there. Yeah.
The hardest thing, man, is just realizing that basically 95% of the food you can eat in the United States right now is poison.
Yeah.
And it's, man, I grew up with all that stuff. I grew up with fast food. I grew up eating Hostess Ding Dongs and all that kind of crap, and I love it to death.
And my mom made gravy for everything.
Oh, well, yeah. My grandma has made the best Southern white gravy. I love all that stuff to this day, but the problem is, once you get diabetes, it's just like, man, there's nothing worse for you, than eating fried chicken or gravy or a bunch of
Hershey
buttered
bars.
rolls or whatever, So it's always kind of a balancing act with me. Of course, when I'm on the road and I'm going through Kansas City, I'm going to get barbecue, If I'm going through, some other place that has some legendary road food, I will eat there. But you can't do it every meal, So I try to chill out when I can and eat healthy stuff. And then obviously you're going to have those situations where there's just no other food available other than the pizza they bring the band.
Right. Well, like you were recently in Spain and Italy, correct? Like, there's no way I could. The temptations of the food of Spain and Italy would be way more than I could.
I know. Well, and I certainly, I had my fill in Italy. It was great.
Yeah, and my problem is that I would go and I say, okay, just one plate of pasta is going to be fine. That's not going to kill me.
Right.
And I'd eat it, and it would be so good. And then I realized that they serve pasta with every meal.
Yeah.
And you're just like, because I think I have the other kind of diabetes. I always forget whether it's one or two. But basically the doctor said, if you lose weight, it's going to go away.
Right.
And it just, losing the weight has been slow.
Yeah, well, I'm type 1, and I have been for about 25 years. So I know what I need to do, and I know when I'm being bad. It's just the whole point is just you can't be bad all the time or else you're going to die,
That's kind of how I feel. I've been lucky. I haven't had too much in the way of foot pain or anything like that. But I'm 56. I know this stuff is coming.
Yeah.
And when he told me that he was going to drive out to meet me, I said, "Are you taking 70?" He goes, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, now you got to stop out of the price, pick up a couple pounds, pick up some salt, blah blah." And I'm thinking in my mind, you could do without that. You could have a salad or something, and then, but you're right. Is when it becomes so easily available, when you're in the place that's the most famous for whatever it is that they serve, you got to try it. And that's why I think if I were on the road all the time, I'd be dead.
Well, luckily I'm not on the road all the time anymore, There was a period of years where I was on the road all the time, and you just constantly eat bad food. And I'm lucky that I'm home a lot, and then I go out, and then I'm home a lot, and I'm out, So I'm not doing 250 something dates on the road like I used to. Well, I am certainly not the poster boy for preaching about anything, but I can say that when you eat healthy foods, and especially if you're diabetic, stay away from the processed carbs, and you get your body really off that stuff, you can't eat the old stuff anymore, Like when I eat McDonald's or if I eat a donut, I literally get sick now. Yeah. I feel sick for about a day or two after I eat that stuff.
Yeah, I gave up sodas a couple of years ago.
Right.
That was a big change right there. I noticed a difference the minute I stopped drinking sodas.
Yeah, totally. I did the same thing.
Now it's just like a little bit of coffee in the morning, water during the day, and then sometimes some tea at night, and I'm good.
You can go as long as you want, man. Now that we got
I don't want to eat up your day or anything. But, there's all sorts of stuff we can talk about. And again, talking about folks that aren't around anymore, I would imagine it would have been a fairly big thrill for you to play with someone like Don Rich.
you know, there's all these guys I wish I could have met and played with. Don Rich and Roy Nichols, who played with Merle Haggard, and a guy named Roy Lanham, Merle Travis, Joe Mapus, and they were all around here for years and years and years, and through the 70s and the 80s, like, they were as uncool could get, you know. They were just out there playing, like, church fairs and things like that, and it's like, man, I wish I'd been a little bit older where I could have moved out here and got to meet those guys and play with those guys. And what's funny is that I've wound up becoming good friends with all of their kids, you know. Every single one of those people I just mentioned, you know, I've wound up talking to their widows or their kids or whatever. And, you know, like, Facebook is great because I'll make some post and Merlene Travis will comment on it, and Lori Mayfis will comment on it, and it's like, wow, I can't believe I'm actually friends with Merle and Joe's daughters.
Well, I've seen you go around and take pictures of people's houses that they used to live in and whatnot. Have you ever had anybody come out and ask you what the hell you're doing, taking pictures of their house?
Well, some people get really weird about that. I've had that happen a couple of times, and I'm pretty good at, like, okay, is it a angry Latino person that's mad because I'm photographing their house? Then you'll make up some excuse like, yes, I'm researching architecture. You know, it's like, is it an angry hillbilly that's coming after me?
Right.
Hey, did you know that a country music legend lived here? Yeah. You know, you got to be able to play off the situation to ensure that you don't get your ass beat. You know.
Yeah.
What's funny about that, you know, is that people don't really realize what a center for country music that Los Angeles really was.
Oh, yeah.
And right around here, where we're talking right now, here in the San Fernando Valley, you know, the list is almost too long.
Well, didn't you just recently find Speedy West's old house?
Speedy West lived about a mile away from here.
Yeah.
Jimmy Bryant lived about a mile and a half away from here. Merle Travis, Joe Mapus, they all lived right around here. Lefty Frizzell lived in Northridge for a time, about 2 miles from here. Johnny Cash, when he first moved out, lived here in the San Fernando Valley. Then he wound up moving out towards Ventura. The list goes on and on. People have no idea how much country music history there is in Los Angeles. And it doesn't really make sense until you realize that it was all a bunch of Okies that moved out here in the first place anyway. Right. And especially after World War II, all those Okies were working in the defense plants, and they were working in all these other, you know, aeronautics plants and things like that. And they wanted to listen to country music, so there was this huge scene for it out here.
And I'm guessing there was a lot of leak over from Bakersfield.
Well, what's interesting is, you know, Bakersfield has its own history, but Glenn, who's a rockabilly guy from here in Los Angeles, he always says the Bakersfield sound is not the Bakersfield sound. The Bakersfield sound is the Los Angeles sound. Mm-hmm. It's just that Buck Owens and Merle Haggard were both from Bakersfield, so it gets called the Bakersfield sound. But he's actually right. You know, if you're talking about guys like Wynn Stewart and guys who really were the architects of that particular sound, they were all Los Angeles guys. And Merle Haggard and Buck Owens were both on Capitol Records, and so they came down here to Los Angeles to record. It's just that Bakersfield sound has a nice ring to it.
It does.
You know.
And every town wants to have a sound.
Exactly. And people still, to this day, they can't really wrap their heads around the Los Angeles country sound. It's just too weird for them, you know.
Right. Okay, so what's next? What's coming? New album? New anything?
I need to make a new album.
The world's first hillbilly protest album? It might be timely.
It could be. You know, I wrestle with making a country music album all the time. I really want to make a country music album. The problem is that, you know, as somebody once told me, the only people who listen to real country music anymore are basically white yuppies. Because the actual country music audience, people who listen to top 40 country music, they like 80s rock and rap and you know, it's not really like country music anymore. If you turn on the country station, it's like, wow, there's a steel guitar and there's a fiddle, but this actually sounds like Journey.
Yeah, or there's a lot more rapping going on in country nowadays than there used to be.
Exactly. I remember when Big and Rich first hit it big, and I was going through Nashville, and we got there a day early, and we had the day off, like, hey, let's go down to Lower Broadway, check out the bands that are playing. Every band had a dude that was just rapping. because Big and Rich
Right.
had just struck it big with their rapper guy. And I thought, wow, how is it that these people are so unimaginative? Like, oh, there's an act on the top 40 right now with a rapper, so we all have to get a rapper. Well, you know, it's interesting, and you know, you live in Indiana, so I know that you totally get this, but I did the weirdest gig in my entire life was doing the Kid Rock cruise. Kid Rock saw us play at this party out here in L.A., and 5 months later, my booking agent calls me, why did Kid Rock's people just call me? I'm really confused. And he wanted to book us for this cruise that he does every year. And so, I have to give that guy credit for one thing. He figured out that there's this huge crowd of people in America who, they kind of like country music, they kind of like classic rock, they kind of like rap, you know, they kind of like white trashy things.
Yeah.
And that guy figured out how to mix all that stuff together. So I got to give him credit for that, even though I wouldn't say that I ever listened to a Kid Rock record at home.
Well, I don't think we're the target audience.
Right, exactly. But it's interesting how if you played any of those people like a Lefty Frizzell record, they would hate it. I would like to do a country record, and I probably will at some point, but I have to be prepared for the fact that it may have a very small audience, smaller than my normal, typical sort of record would have. So that's really what I would love to do. Whether or not that's next, I don't know.
I don't see where. I mean, I think fans of yours would buy it anyway, just because it's you. Do you think that the difference in style would be so severe that it would turn people off? I mean,
I guess it depends on how it sounded and how good the songs were and everything else. You know?
Because I like Gary Stewart as much as I like the Delmore Brothers. I mean,
right.
You know, I can listen to either. I'm okay.
And you know, I see that crowd of people, and it's a lot of younger kids that are getting into vintage country and thinking it's cool. And it's getting bigger, so, you know, maybe at some point it'll actually be worthwhile.
Well, good for them, because it is cool.
It is cool, absolutely.
We just figured it out before they did.
Absolutely. And sometimes it takes a few decades for something to be okay to like, you know.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's funny, because I was discussing with him last night about, you know, in the 70s when I was all Mr. Punk Rock, you know, I was like, down with disco. Disco sucks, blah, blah,
right.
blah, blah, blah. And now, sometimes I'll hear one of those songs and I'll go, you know, that's just some R&B with a drum beat behind it. That's not too bad. And I actually hear songs now where I'm going, oh, you know, that's not too bad.
Yeah.
So.
Well, when I was growing up in the 70s, man, I hated stuff like Sly and the Family Stone or Earth, Wind and Fire
right.
or Chicago or those kind of things. And it's still not exactly my type of music, but when you go back and listen to that stuff, and especially when you go back and look at YouTube videos of that stuff, those guys were awesome. They were so good at what they did, you know, and there's nothing like that around today.
Have you seen some of the footage of Sly and the Family Stone, like live on Ed Sullivan? They almost ripped the roof off of that thing. It's
absolutely.
Like there's like 10 people in the band, and like 5 of them are just running around the audience, like grabbing people, and you're going, how did they, you know, Ed's trying to talk the Doors into not say higher. How did these people get away with this?
Yeah.
You know? And, you know, a lot of it was just, because Sly and the Family Stone was one that I kind of got into late, but it was after I saw some film footage of them where I just went like, I can't believe this. Why is Funkadelic getting all the credit?
Right.
When it was Sly and the Family Stone was doing it, you know, maybe even a year or two earlier. You know? And
I also think, you know, when you're 15 years old, simple stuff works for you. Punk rock,
sure.
Johnny Cash, that's easy to understand. But
yeah.
I think you have to be over 30 to be able to understand all these different kind of things, awesomeness. Like for me, it took me forever to get Charlie Rich, you know. It was like, Charlie Rich just does ballads. And then once I was about 35 years old, I'm like, that guy...
The Smash Sessions was the one that did it for me.
Oh, man. That guy may be the best Memphis guy of all. You know,
so soulful.
And
I mean, you could match him up against Ray Charles.
Yeah, absolutely.
Equal soul.
And again, like some of these other guys, you know, he went through a rockabilly era, he went through a soul era, he went through an R&B era, then he went into like his, you know, countrypolitan area. It's all great, man.
And even that's look. I mean, it's not like life has its little ups and downs. or I do my swinging at home. I mean, look, I'm getting weepy just thinking about them. I mean, because they're,
Right, but
they're
you wouldn't
very
have-
emotional. I mean,
You wouldn't have understood that when you were 15.
No, when I was a kid, I used to hear behind closed doors, and I'd go like,
Right.
I know what they're doing. But you listen to it now, and you're going like, God damn, that's a beautiful song.
Yep.
You know, and you know, his wife wrote a lot of the songs with him.
Mm-hmm.
Because I didn't really pay any attention to him until after I'd read the chapter on him in that Peter Gorelnik book that I can't remember the name of. And
Probably
after
got several of them.
Yeah, and after I read that, I was like, oh, well, I like Ray Charles. Maybe I should check this out.
Yeah.
And I got the Smash Sessions, and was the one book, Smash Sessions, that's the one that has Put My Hands in the Muddy Water
Mm-hmm.
and Mohair Sam and stuff. Yeah, I mean, that was like instant. I mean, I like that stuff even better than the Sun records. So yeah, it's what they say, that your music changes, or your music taste changes every 7 years.
Yeah.
Or not changes, but maybe morphs.
Right.
And I found that to be fairly true, because I mean, there were types of music that I literally grew up detesting.
Right.
I hated reggae. I absolutely hated reggae. And then finally, it just occurred to me one day, I was like, I don't know why I hate reggae. I've never listened to any. And I knew a guy, I gave him some tapes, and poof, everything was fine.
Right.
So and it's the same with country, same with jazz. I haven't quite gotten there with fusion jazz yet.
Well, yeah.
You
You
know,
don't have
and
to
I
like
don't
everything.
know. I don't know if I'm going to or not. I mean, I think I can appreciate Jaco Pastorius more than I can actually listen to.
There's no rule that says you have to like everything.
Yeah.
But, you know, for me, it's funny how a few decades goes by and then you can analyze something totally differently. You know, like when Duran Duran and all those kind of bands came out in the 80s, I despised them. And now you realize, like, those guys played all their own instruments, and they sang in tune, without auto-tune.
Right.
Like, those guys were really good at what they did.
Yep.
And Garth Brooks, you know, when he first came out, I despised Garth Brooks. You go back and listen to something like Friends in Low Places, it's like, that's actually a really good country song.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, compared to Big and Rich or whatever's on the country charts right now, it's great.
Yeah. And you know, as far as poppy stuff is concerned, I mean, like I try not to throw too much shade at stuff that's popular, because I always say, hey, look, 13-year-old girls need something to listen to as well.
Yeah.
I didn't start out at Captain Beefheart. I got there much later, you know. So everybody starts somewhere.
Yeah.
Hey, you know, I used to love the Osmonds. The Osmonds was my first concert that I ever saw, and they were great. They rocked hard. They did Crazy Horses and Down by the Lazy River, all the rocking songs that you'd want to see. They had great choreography, lots of energy. And then me and my cousin spent most of the time with our binoculars looking at Marie, because we could see her sitting backstage. She didn't perform. She was just with them.
Oh,
and we were just like looking at her through these binoculars going, oh, she sure is pretty. But yeah, I'll defend the Osmonds to this day. They had some great rocking songs. They put on a good show, and I was 12. I was the right age for it. You know?
Exactly.
You know, they've got a couple of songs where if you closed your eyes and before the vocals started, you'd be convinced that you're listening to a Led Zeppelin outtake.
Right.
Because they went through this period, they're late, where they wanted some street cred. So they got a couple of songs, they got out like that, you know. But I used to be real insulting to music that I didn't like, but now I kind of see it all as a big wide palette that some of it's not for me.
Right. I was just going to say, like, you know, now that I'm in my 40s, for me, I just like something if it's good.
Yeah.
Whether it's a disco band actually playing their own instruments and doing a really good job with it, I would rather see something that's just good rather than some guys in a rockabilly band who are not good.
Right.
You know what I mean? Even if it's not the type of music I like versus the type of music I do like, I just want to see it done well. And the sad thing for me in 2017 is that for whatever reason, there's just not as much stuff being done really well as there used to be. And that may just be, you know, old fart syndrome. I'm not sure what it is, but it's like, no, I remember all these bands got really good at their craft. Mm-hmm. And now in this really sort of disposable internet age, like, bands kind of work on it for a couple weekends, and then they go do some shows, and then they break up, and that's about as far as they get these days, you know.
Well, you know, also, big labels used to sort of act as a filter back in the 60s and 70s. I mean, by the time you got signed, you had to go through so much crap and probably play so often to so many people that by the time you got to the point where you were going to make a record, you're probably pretty well polished, you probably had a stage show down, you probably had a good idea of what you wanted to accomplish. And nowadays, like, one guy is going to do something funny, throw it on YouTube, and he's like instantaneously famous.
Right.
And then everybody wants a piece of him, and then everybody gets a piece of him, and then a month later, all those pieces are gone, and this person just kind of disappears into the ether. And since there's not the big money payoff in being a band these days like there used to be, I think a lot of people just don't do it because they don't see any money at the end of the rainbow.
That's for sure. I mean, it's even starting in the 80s. I remember a band would come to town. They would play at the Blue Note, the local club in Columbia, Thursday through Sunday. They'd play 4 nights in a row, and it would be packed every single night.
Yeah.
They'd go home with a bunch of money in their pants, and nowadays you can't do that. You play one night, you maybe will get 100 people out if you're lucky, 200 people on a great night. I remember back in the 80s, it was like 300-400 people at a club every single night, So it's just, it's not the financial guarantee it used to be.
No, and from what I understand, it's expensive to be on a road. If you have to pay a salary for 4 or 5 guys in your band and your driver and maybe a couple of roadies, your bottom line drops quick.
Yeah, well, that's why I tour with a trio. I used to be a 4-piece band, and then if you remember, right when gas went from 99 cents a gallon to like $2 a gallon, we can't afford this 4th guy anymore. And then when it got to like $5 a gallon, like right around 2007, 2008, whenever that was, I was am I going to have to be a solo act?
Actually, I know people that do go out by themselves just because they need to earn money so they can afford their next band tour.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah, so that's not uncommon at all. But yeah, and as far as, you can tell me if I'm wrong, but as far as I can see from the outside looking in, these days all the money is in licensing your songs for like a film or a TV show.
Yeah, absolutely.
That seems to be where the money is now.
Yeah.
And I'm assuming that's not an easy thing to get done.
The problem is, especially in a place like LA, is there's a million people trying to do it, And I've been lucky because I have been able to get quite a few things over the years, but it's always been 1 to 3 projects a year. And you think to yourself, man, if I could get 10 projects a year, I'd be rich. I'd be living large, you know, but it just doesn't work out like that. So you just kind of wait until somebody wants that specific thing that I can do that nobody else can do, and you do it and hope that it turns into something else.
Yeah, because, I mean, the only people that are buying records these days are people in our age bracket. Yeah. People who don't know how to download something or don't know how to use their Spotify or their kid's Spotify or whatever. And I'm sure you remember, when I used to record shop back in the 70s, I got a job when I was 15 just because I wanted records. Nobody was buying them for me, and I needed them. Yeah. So I got a job. I lied about my age and got a job washing dishes when I was 15, and we get paid every 2 weeks. I get my paycheck on a Friday. I would cash it. On Saturday, I would go to 2 or 3 different record stores, grab some lunch, and then be broke for 2 weeks. I'd have nothing left because I knew what I wanted, and the way we do is we'd go through the record store, we'd just pick out everything we wanted, and you'd end up with about 10 or 12, but you could only afford 4 or 5. So you'd walk around the store looking at them. Do I want this one more than that one? Let's see, my friend's got this one. I can listen to his. I can save money for a week. And get there was a lot of thought that went into it. Nowadays, and I'm not trying to be the guy trying to kick kids off my lawn or anything, but nowadays, you grab your skateboard, and you're out the door. And you've got whatever it is that you want to listen to on your iPad or your phone or whatever. Right. And you're done. You're done. Whereas, it used to be like a decision that would tax you. You'd be going, which one of these Pink Floyd albums is the one that everyone says is good? Is it this one? Is it this one? Or for me, it was which one is the one that comes with 2 posters and 2 stickers in it? Right. Because I loved albums that had extra stuff in it. Right. And, I just think... And I don't want to be the old guy trying to kick kids off my lawn, but I think there was a certain amount of fun that we probably had as far as the record experience is concerned that kids aren't having anymore. And they're certainly not going to have it if they go to the record store and there's a copy of Quadrophenia there for $80. Right. Have you seen these, right? They keep putting out these classic albums, but they have these price tags on them.
I keep
that I'm
wondering
just
who's
like,
buying all these $25 and $30 vinyl LPs. I mean, because I can't afford them.
I say follow the hair bun.
Right.
I think that's what it's, because I go to, when I'm in town, I always just stop in Amoeba and look around and see what's going on. And yeah, Quadrophenia, when they reissued it a couple of years ago, the price tag was $80. And I kept thinking, you could probably go on eBay or just check a used record store. You could probably find a used one in good condition for about 10 or 12 bucks, probably. But no, I think the vinyl craze might actually die out eventually because I mean, how long can people afford to pay that much for something?
It doesn't seem sustainable to me. I mean, and I sell a lot of vinyl on the road, and I always ask these young kids, like, hey, what kind of record player you got at home? Mm-hmm. Most of them don't have a record player. They're just buying it because it has a download card and because they think records are cool.
Right.
And when people are buying it just for some reason like that, it's not a sustainable thing. Yeah. So I'll be very curious to see where that's all winds up in 10 years.
I'll tell you, when I realized how things had changed, I was working. Do you remember that movie that came out a few years ago that had Will Smith in it, where he was like a person with superhero things, but he was kind of a bum at the same time? I worked as a background actor in that movie in the prison scenes, and so I'm standing around talking to this kid once, and he says, man, because I work today, tomorrow, and Friday. He says, by then I'm going to have enough money for that tattoo that I want. And I was like, how much money do you need? And he goes, it's like $1,200. I'm getting this dragon, and it's going to be crushing a tank or doing whatever it is they're doing. And I looked at him, and I goes, $1,200 for a tattoo? I said, why don't you just buy a nice stereo? And he looked at me with the weirdest look, and he goes, what would I do with a stereo?
Yeah.
And there was another one of those light bulbs that went like, ding.
Yeah.
And I was just like, you're old.
Yep.
And it's true. I mean, nowadays, a laptop and your phone is all kids need, and they got all the music they want.
Yeah.
So just like that, instantaneous. And I'll admit, even for me, a lot of times, because it used to be you'd read about a band, and then you'd go, well, I'm never going to hear them on the radio, and I might only find out about them in an article from Cream. I mean, there's a chance that a year or two would pass before you'd hear of a band and then actually hear them.
Sure, yeah.
Now, if I hear about someone, let's go to YouTube and go up if they've got something on there I can listen to real quick. I'm just as guilty as anybody else. You know how it is. You hear about something and it sounds like something that you're going to like, you want to hear it.
Yeah.
So, and I grew up in a time where, you wouldn't know the Who had a new album out until you actually saw an ad for it, Cream.
Right.
Nowadays, it's in the news that Pete Townsend was seen walking into a studio for an album that's going to come out, a year in advance when something's going to come out. And it's so totally different that I think maybe it makes people maybe not appreciate the music as much, or at least not give it the value that we gave it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Well, there was an article, and I can't remember where it was published, but it was like Forbes or Money or something like that, and it was in the 2000s sometime, and it was very interesting because it had done a study of what people spent on music through the Victrola era, through LPs and 45s, through 8-tracks, through the cassettes, through CDs, until the age of the internet. Through all those eras, they had spent basically 4 to 6% of their disposable income on music. Mm-hmm. Music was that important to people, It didn't matter whether it was 78 records or cassettes, they spent 4 to 6% of their disposable income on music. When the internet comes around, and you get to about 1999 or 2000, when Napster and YouTube and all these kind of things start happening, that figure splinters. And all of a sudden, people are only spending a small percentage of 1% on music. And it's been that way ever since. And so you kind of have to look at that data and say to yourself, we might be the last generation that really cares enough about music to spend all of our money on records, to chase down all these artists. And I think the music will always be around and people will always like it, but it's just interesting to me that data shows that it was that dramatic. Like right then and there when the internet happened, it was like bang, you're dividing your attention between video games and DVDs and, you know, internet surfing and music, and it's just all one of a million distractions.
Yeah, I know. I mean, the world has changed before our eyes, slow enough that we didn't notice it until it got here. And now that it's here, it seems like it was obvious the whole time.
Yeah.
You know?
Well, there's certain great things about it. You know, I remember back in the day, if you were trying to collect an artist like Skeets McDonald, you know,
Sure.
It might take you like 3 years to find 3 Skeets McDonald 45s. And you're like, man, how long is it going to take me to find all the Skeets McDonald records? And then YouTube comes along. Now it's 2017. You can listen to 175 Skeets McDonald records. Like,
Yeah.
everything he ever recorded is on YouTube, you know?
Well, for me, I'd say somewhere between that and where we are now was the Bear family.
Right.
Every time I wanted something, I'd just go, well, I'll just go look up the Bear family. They probably have something.
Sure.
And it was never probably. It was always, and they always had like 5 box sets from the guy. And you're like going, how can I afford all of these? I mean, but yeah, that, you know, the Bear family there for a while was kind of a big lifesaver for me, because I got, you know, that Speedy West and Jimmy Bryant box set, which is about as good as it gets. That I have both the Johnny Horton box sets, but that second one is just, that's what, as far as country is concerned, it's my favorite stuff. I could listen to Honky Tonk Hardwood Floor 10 times a day for the rest of my life, and I'll be just fine. There was the Buck Owens box sets, which I got that blue one first, the domestic one that came out over here, and that was, you know, again, me growing up, Buck Owens was that guy on Hee-Haw.
Yeah.
And the same with Roy Clark. They were those guys on Hee-Haw. I didn't know that they were as good as they were. I just thought they were guys telling jokes on Hee-Haw. You know, and then when I heard, like, I think it was like, Who's Gonna Mow Your Grass? And I'm like, holy shit, listen to the guitar on that.
Yeah.
And then the Merle Travis box was my favorite.
Yeah.
I got that thing, and I think I lived with him when I had it, and I probably drove him crazy with it. I was just like...
Well, the Merle Travis box set was the reason I bought a CD player.
Yeah,
Back in the early 90s.
I'm saying, listen to this. He's playing faster than the Ramones.
Yeah.
You know, and yeah, the Bear fans, they're still around, aren't they?
Well, I was going to say, you know, the sad thing is that I've done a lot of work for them, and the owner of Bear Family, Richard Weitza, he sold it last year because he basically said, we can't sell our box sets anymore. You know, the minute that we put out a box set, some joker puts every single song on YouTube, and then we can, you know, like, they have to sell probably 1,000 of them to break even.
Yeah.
And once you start throwing every single song up on YouTube, or it gets on streaming services or something like that, all of a sudden you're selling 200 or 300 copies, and you can't make enough to pay your expenses. You know.
Look, I would imagine the booklets that they put in those things are expensive enough.
Oh,
they're not cheap. Those are always like really nice bound slip
Yeah.
paper booklets. I mean, the reason I like the Bear Family so much is because they did it right.
Yeah.
You know, and not only that, if you bought it, then you pretty much knew that you had everything.
Right.
You didn't have to worry about finding anything more. I got it all. I'm good.
And it was all mastered correctly and everything else. You know, there's so many things that I bought over the years. It's like, man, I just should have started with the Bear Family thing, because they mastered it correctly. It's got the best liner notes. It's got the best photos, whatever.
Now, you wrote some liner notes for some of those, right?
I've done a bunch of stuff for Bear Family, yeah.
Which ones did you write liner notes for?
As far as box sets go, I've written 2 Merle Haggard box sets and a Bonnie Owens box set, and then I've done probably 40 or 50 single CD things.
I used to get catalogs from them in the mail, and I haven't gotten one in a long time. So
Yeah.
I was kind of wondering if.
Well, he sold it last year, and it's still a label, and I haven't dealt it all with the new owners, so I don't know what they're planning on doing with it. But I don't see how any of these guys are staying in business anymore, because, like I said, you know, you used to sell 4 times as much as you did then, and you were barely making any profit margin then. So how do you make an excuse for selling 300 copies of a box set? You know,
You're right. Yeah, and you know, they were never cheap. And I'm not saying they were too expensive. I'm just saying they were never cheap. And so when I knew one was coming out, I'd go, oh shit, I got to start saving.
Yeah.
You know, because I mean, the problem was I didn't want just one. I was like 20 or 30 of them that I wanted, and they were always $100 to $200 a pop, especially by the time they got here.
Yeah.
You know, so I only had a certain amount of them, but I love those records. Like, I mean, because like you said, they're done right. You know, they've got. just the pictures. You're wondering where they found some of these pictures, you know.
Yeah,
and the liner
absolutely.
notes were always exhaustive. They tell you everything. All right, cool. Well, you know, I'm thinking we could probably wind it down.
Okay.
Did you? Would it be possible for me to film you just a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
Particularly about. Actually, stop right here before we end this thing.
Okay.
You need to tell everybody the story of Johnny Horton's stereo.
Okay, so this funny story, I believe it was 2015, 2 years ago. 3 or 4 people email me in the morning when I wake up. Check this out! Johnny Horton's record player is $250 and it's in central LA. And so I'm looking at this Craigslist ad, and it's like, wow, that's amazing. It's this giant stereo console. It's all cool, 50s looking, and it's $250. So I email the guy, I want it. I want this. Consider it sold. And the guy emails back. He's like, okay, well, I'm in the little town of Minnie, Louisiana. I'm like, oh, it wasn't the central Los Angeles Craigslist. It was the central Louisiana Craigslist. So then it was like, how do I make this happen? And I had sort of committed to it, you know. So I had this friend of mine who was working in New Orleans at the time go up to Minnie, Louisiana and pick it up from this guy who had it in a museum, and then drive it to another buddy's place in Baton Rouge, and it sat there in Baton Rouge for about 6 months until I was able to pick it up. Now, keep in mind that this 320-pound, 8-foot-long thing didn't work. It was non-operational, so it was kind of like, you know, my boat anchor folly kind of thing, and I brought it back here, and just getting one of those old stereo consoles disassembled was a feat, because it's put together like an octopus. It's just unbelievable. I got it all apart. I sent it to a guy in Ohio to rebuild all the you know, the preamp and the power amps and everything else like that. Now, in the meantime, I had been posting about it on Facebook, and 2 of Johnny Horton's daughters contacted me, and they were very angry. How did you get my father's stereo? We want our father's stereo back. And so I was dealing with this guy from the museum, and he's like, well, Billie Jean Horton donated it, you know, back in the 80s or 90s or something, you know, and he sent me the letter like he had gotten from Billie Jean Horton. And it put me in an awkward place, because it's like, well, why did you let this out of your family's hands? Like, if you wanted it that bad, why didn't you get it from Billie Jean, you know? That sort of thing is always uncomfortable, because you feel bad for the family members, and at the same time, especially with guitars, when I've seen guys give them back to family members, the first thing the family members do is turn around and sell it.
Right.
So, you know, it was kind of like, wow, this is great. Now I've ticked off Johnny Horton's daughters. Now they hate me. But at the same time, it's like, what would have happened to it in Minnie, Louisiana? Like, it probably would have gone to Goodwill, or he would have put it out on the, you know. So I restored the thing. I got it back together, and now it lives again. And what's an interesting side note is that the guy who had gotten the stuff from Billie Jean, he operated this little museum for a while. He had sold a bunch of stuff on eBay. And during the course of me posting about it on Facebook and doing the restoration, this guy in Maine, of all places, contacted me and said, you know, I bought a bunch of awards from that guy. And I had discovered that Johnny Horton got this stereo from Columbia Records for the sale of 2 million copies of Battle of New Orleans. They gave it to him as a gift.
Right.
And he said, you know, I actually have the gold records from Battle of New Orleans that I got from this guy. He said, I'll sell them to you, because I bought like 15 awards, you know, like I don't need all of them. I don't even have space to hang them up. So he sold me the 278 and the 245 you know, awards that Columbia Records had given him at the same time that they gave him this stereo. And so that's my little shrine you see there in the living room.
Well, we're going to retire over to there and just do a little short thing that people can take a peek at on the website. So,
I will just say this, that you know, when I was having conversations with Johnny Horton's daughters, one of them told me, I remember my dad writing North to Alaska on that tape recorder, on that stereo. Like, he used it to, like, make his demo for North to Alaska on that tape recorder. So yeah, every time I look at that thing, I'm just like, wow, I can't believe that that's in my living room now.
All right, well, let's go give other folks a chance to take a peek.
Deke was out back laying out licks. His eyes got heavy, the hour got long, the sky was black as a miner's song. Then a clap of thunder and a flash of light told old Knothead something wasn't right. He thought for sure he'd met his fate. He was standing in line at the pearly gates. Then this feller with a long white beard said, man, there's standing room only up here. You can pluck that box and pluck it fair. We can book you a room in a place downstairs. There's a lot of chicken pickers, known as well by far, but you ain't heard nothing till you heard old Deke pick his hot guitar. Now Deke didn't feel like picking right then, but he got to thinking about a fiery den. When he smelled something burning, he changed his mind. Look out, it's Merle Travis time. Well, St. Pete said, well, that's a pretty good try, but I've always favored that Memphis guy. Chicken pickers, known as well by far, but you ain't heard nothing till you heard old Deke pick his hot guitar. Now Pete said it'd be a mighty sin to miss Tiny Moore and his mandolin. And a band of angels gave out with a call, we want to sit in with old Les Paul. Now there's a lot of chicken pickers, known as well by far, but you ain't heard nothing till you heard old Deke pick his hot guitar. Then Gabriel said, I'll bet my horn you can play me a lick like Scotty Moore. Well, them saints could pick on the head of a pin through Luther and Burton and Chet Atkins. St. Pete said, give me that two-headed thing, I'll play it like Deke and make it ring. The sky went red and like a shot he sat up in bed. The only proof he had of his heavenly gig was a clump of feathers in his guitar rig. Now there's a lot of chicken pickers, known as well